Hi everyone, I'm Lisa from Pink Hollywood Designs. Welcome to my sewing studio where we talk all things sewing and smocking. Today we are talking about smocking, specifically about how to efficiently pleat fabric for smocking. So this was a question that was submitted by one of my customers. She's just starting out with smocking, and she wanted to know, was there a way to not have to rethread the pleater every time she was going to pleat something? So I have the answer to that question, as well as 5 tips on how to pleat efficiently. Okay, so first let's answer the question, do you have to rethread the pleater every time? Well, the answer is yes and no. Of course, we don't have an easy one, right? If you mean, can you just thread the pleater once and leave it permanently threaded? No. You do have to thread it each pleating session that you're going to have. You can, however, pleat multiple items before you cut the threads, so you don't have to rethread it between each individual piece that you're pleating. So why can't you leave it permanently threaded? Well, if you think about it, the pleated piece of fabric, once you put it through the pleater, it is in between the pleating needles and the spool of thread. And the only way to set that piece free is to now cut the threads at the spool end and therefore set it free. So that means that you can pleat like multiple pieces of fabric before you cut those threads, but then the only way to set your pleated pieces free, is our little tongue twister there, is to actually cut those threads, and therefore you will then have to rethread before you complete again. Okay, also to clarify, because my customer asked, did it make a difference on how you threaded it, whether you had a thread box, and the answer is no, it doesn't. You can thread the pleater from the bottom up, you can thread it from the top down, you can pleat with the needles towards you, you can pleat with the needles away from you, and you can have that thread box as well. None of that makes a difference. The pleated piece of fabric is still in between the pleater and the needles, and therefore to set it free, you have to cut the threads. Okay, so let's assume that you do want to try though and pleat efficiently, and you want to pleat several different pieces before you have to rethread those needles. So the first thing is, yes, you can pleat multiple pieces as long as you're using the same number of needles. It really is, it is theoretically possible to pleat a piece of fabric, open the pleater up, take out the needles, then put the bar back in, but you're really taking a chance on the needles falling out, especially when they're threaded, and it isn't worth it. What I would recommend is, if you are pleating different pieces of fabric and you need them pleated with different numbers of smocking rows, if the fabric isn't one that marks easily, so the typical cottons that we're using, then what I would do is just set the pleater up with the maximum number of rows that you need pleated, pleat your first piece, and then just continue to pleat even the pieces that maybe you're pleating additional rows that you don't need, and just remove those pleating threads once you've separated the pieces out. Okay, let's get into our tips for how to pleat efficiently. So the first tip is, you need a spool of thread for each pleating needle. You don't want to just cut the threads to the length you need. Instead, you want a whole spool of thread so you can just keep pleating pieces and the thread keeps feeding. So I use hand quilting cotton, a little bit thicker, a little bit stronger than my all-purpose thread. And I'm here in the US, I stock up on this when Joann's has a sale. So they usually have sales for like buy 3, get 2 free kind of things. So this is Gutermann 100% hand quilting cotton thread that I use. Okay, the second tip is that you need a way to keep the threads from tangling. And that's where the pleater box comes in. If you wondered what the purpose of a pleater box is, that is its purpose. It keeps each thread separate. It keeps them feeding so they don't tangle as they're feeding. And because of course, if they do get tangled, you're stuck. You now have to cut it and untangle it, and you're going to have to replete the piece. Okay, the third and probably most important tip is if you're pleating multiple items, in order to have that work and not break a needle and not have the thread pull out, you need to make sure you keep all tension off of the needles and off of the pleater. So what do I mean by that? Well, I typically pleat by standing at my cutting table, and I have my pleater in front of me, and that is where I'm pleating. I have friends who pleat at their ironing board. I don't think I really have that many friends who pleat sitting down. If you can do it, more power to you, but I find to really pleat well, I kind of need to be standing over it, be able to bend over, see how it's feeding in, and just I like the control that being up above it gives me. So as I'm pleating at my cutting table, I pleat with the needles towards me, the fabric away from me, and pleating towards me. So, and then I will let the piece I've already pleated go down onto the floor. Now, just doing that puts tension on those needles. So, because of the weight of the piece I've already pleated. So what I have found is when I'm doing multiple pieces, I can't do that. I've got to get them up on the table that the pleater's on so that those pieces are not putting tension on the pleater itself. Now you also can get tension on the threads. So again, I put my pleater box on the floor. I don't want the additional height of putting the pleater on top of the box, but a lot of people do have the pleater on top of the box. Wherever you have the box, it doesn't matter, or even if you don't have a box and you just have your threads free, you have to make sure that as the fabric's going through, that thread doesn't get caught and start to have a little tension on it. So as I'm pleating, what I'll do is the minute I see it start to have a little tension, I'll grab my threads at the box point and just pull some loose so there's no tension. Another way to handle this is my friend Julie, she pleats with things going away from her, right? So she starts the fabric towards her, the needle's facing away, and she's pleating away from her. That way, when she has the piece finished, it's naturally laying on the table behind her and not what I'm dealing with going on the floor. So that is one argument for why you might want to pleat away. Personally, I've tried it. I've pleated for so many years with it coming towards me. That's just how I do it. And as I've talked to different people, it seems that whatever way you learn is kind of the way you want to do it. So if you're just learning, try learning with pleating away from you. I think you'll find it then helps to do multiple pieces easier. Okay, the fourth tip is you need to be aware of how much thread you eventually need to block the piece. So what I mean by this is, let's say you're pleating multiple little dresses, okay? So let's say you're going to pleat a skirt and you're going to be blocking that to 20 inches, just for example. Okay, so you put the skirt through, pull it through, and now that you've got that skirt pleated, you're going to go on to pleating your next skirt. Let's say you have that piece squished up to like 10 inches. That's fine while you're pleating. But eventually when you're done pleating and you go to cut your threads, if you haven't allowed enough thread for each piece for blocking, you're now going to be short your thread when you go to block it. And you're going to have to unpleat something. So as you're pulling this, you're doing your different pieces, make sure you are allowing enough thread. When I do this, for example, for Pink Hollybush, I sell the pre-pleated inserts and I sell the ornament strips for the ornaments. And because I am shipping them, I want to be able to ship them flat. So I am pulling them so you can completely flatten the piece. And that's another thing you also might be dealing with. For example, let's say that you're making a dress where you're going to pleat the sleeve because you want to make smocking at the bottom of the sleeve. But you have to be able to, after you pleat it, you need to be able to completely flatten that sleeve out so that you can finish the bottom edge. So make sure you've allowed enough thread to do that before you cut your pleating threads. Okay, so if you incorporate all of these tips, what is your limit? How many pieces can you put through that pleater before you have to cut your threads? Well, theoretically, there is no limit. I remember this story of a saga teacher who, Smocking Arts Guild of America, and she was pleating up for convention for her different classes, all the kits. And she would pleat from one end of the house to the other. She would just put it through and then do the next one. And that might sound fantastic, but here, of course, there's always got to be some kicker, right? Well, the kicker is, the problem with that is you have to keep moving the piece you finished along the threads, and that can take a lot of time. So personally, when I am pleating up the strips for the ornaments, I never do more than 2. And I know that sounds like a lot, but what I found is I'll put one through. Now I have to pull it along the threads for the entire width, because remember, I'm going to ship it flat. So that means I have to pull it along 40 inches of thread. Now put another one through. Pull that one along 40 inches of thread. And what I found was it was quicker for me to just cut it and rethread the needles. So my last tip, tip number 5, is try just timing how long it actually takes you to rethread those needles. It kind of can be a pain. It's one of those things we just think, oh, I have to go thread. Like if I'm doing the ornaments, it's 11 needles that I'm threading, and you think, gee, that takes forever. Well, not really. I can thread them in less than 5 minutes, and I've found that I can spend more time than that trying to move those different pieces along the threads, hope that nothing gets tangled. Yes, I have a pleater box to keep my threads from getting tangled, but the pleating threads can still easily get tangled in the raw edge of your strips. So on those raw edges of the strips, all 4 edges of the strip that you're pleating, the raw edges, you'll have sort of, threads, and they'll get tangled in the pleating threads as you're moving along, and now you're stuck and you just have to cut it. So sometimes I get greedy and try to do 3 strips, but for the most part, I only do 2. And I just found that was quicker for me. And you're thinking, I don't know, Lisa, last fall and Christmas time, I pleated over 100 strips for ornaments, and I did them almost all of them 2 at a time. And when I would go for that third one, I often found either the tension or some tension on my needles would cause like one of the threads to come out before I caught it. Now I have to replete that piece. Or I was finding that they would get caught in the raw edges, and now something's tangled and I have to pull that piece out again. So I hope some of these tips will give you something to think about, but really probably my biggest takeaway is you can get quick at threading those needles and don't let that stop you. I hope you'll try. Some of these will be helpful at helping you to be more efficient in your pleating. And if you like this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe. I will be coming back with more smocking and sewing tips. In the meantime, happy smocking.